Hello everyone, this is Rajesh Sengupta and we are here in the second installment of our week on colonial interventions and Khadi. And so in the last lecture we started discussing on this idea of portable museum and then how people were also made movable. So it's kind of like, of course, people move, but at the same time that, how we can see during this time for the sake of this exhibitions and some of these projects that artisans were moved from one place to another as part of the display. So what is this idea of the portable museum? So as we can see that, after this huge success of this 1851 exhibition project in London, that is the Great Exhibition 1851, we see that there was a drive towards having systematic catalogs and at the same time collection of the objects for people to see them, to appreciate them, and also to support the British government for the colonial rule. So for that thing we see that during this time a number of people came forward who were involved in making the museums, archives and so on, and one of them would be James Forbes Watson, and he was documenting a large number of textiles, and the textile documentation was not because he was a textile enthusiast, but his focus was more in the commerce around textiles. So in the 1860s and so on, we see that he had accumulated a large variety of textile from the Indian subcontinent, and eventually he came up with this display strategy in which we can see this movable or this portable setup that we have on screen, which was used or which was called as a portable museum, in which we can sort of the viewers can walk around this area and also can sort of move this this vertical display screens in which all the textile swatches and other objects are sort of kept, and people can read about them, see the fragments of them, and sort of enhance their sort of experience of visiting these venues. Now this kind of portable museum display was made especially for the people who cannot really come to London. So this kind of portable display setup can be sent to different places, and then how those can be sort of seen by many people who cannot visit London or those metropolitan centers. So this kind of strategies we find that they were also made possible in the 1870s, and even in the even today we see that some of the museums in the Indian subcontinent and other places still have this kind of display setups in which the viewers can flip through certain this display screens. So for example, the Craft Museum in Delhi and other places, and not surprisingly that a number of these displays are of textiles, because it also started with textiles in the 1870s. Now with these things we see that, as I have already mentioned, that some of the people were also made portable, and they were definitely not made portable on their own wish, but the British government, they wanted these people to be present at the exhibition venue. Now this idea, or perhaps one can say that why there was a need for the artisans to sort of be present in the exhibition venue is to sort of give authenticity to the kind of objects which were displayed in England or in part of the Western Europe. So we see that this one particular exhibition that is called the Colonial and India Exhibition in 1886. Now if we see the transition, that in the 1851 exhibition it was called the Great Exhibition, and in which all the colonial countries which were there under the British rule were sort of objects from all those countries were displayed, and of course the India section was one of the most prominent ones in that one. But then their interest to sort of showcase the craftsmanship or the artisanal objects of the Indian subcontinent, that made them eager to sort of dedicate exhibitions which were more sort of focused on India. And as I have already mentioned, that this kind of India focused exhibitions, so for example this one in 1886, were not really to praise the artisans in India. Of course certain kind of appreciation were there for the artisans, but it was the underlying, the idea one can see is that what kind of wanderers, so-called wanderers, items, objects were produced in this country which was now being ruled by the British government. So this kind of this innate sense of hierarchy, that the hierarchy to rule over the land, this objects, and then eventually on the people, is something that was very much ingrained in this kind of exhibition strategies. And for that reason these people were also treated as the objects which were snatched or taken from the land and then transported to the museum collections in Europe. And then of course, like I mean, these people who were also sort of brought from the Indian subcontinent and brought to the exhibition venue for people to see them live at work. And of course, like I mean, the master artisans, they came back to India, and some of them had also sort of contributed to making of different kind of other designs and other forms of craftsmanship. But then we can see that, I mean, what kind of intention was there in for these people to travel to England or other parts of Western Europe for these exhibitions. So these are two images from this exhibition in which we can see that the silk brocade weavers of Varanasi, and then like I mean, we also have the carpet weavers here. So this vertical setup of doing carpet, and then of course, like I mean, you know, this draw loom setup in which we see the weavers are seated here, and then like the draw person is there to like sort of, I mean, lift the warp. So this kind of like I mean, this elaborate setup with loom, people, and then the columns and everything, all were brought from India and to the exhibition venue. The same thing happened for the carpet weavers as well. So this kind of elaborate displays were made all around textiles in the 19th century for sort of like I mean, as part of this colonial cataloging, at the same time colonial archiving, not only of the objects but also of the people. Now if we see this, the idea of like I mean, how this archives, they sort of started taking place, or like I mean, they started shaping up, we see that I mean, the roots of making archives were perhaps there in the late 18th century. So some of the things we can see that how all those things which were collected eventually. So for example, we have an image of this dye stuff in the right side of the screen. We'll come to the description, but all those like I mean, either the objects or like the documentation, the records, all of them were, when they were accumulated initially for this great exhibition in 1851, and then like I mean, the subsequent documentation and so on from the India Office, library, and other places. So then with all those objects, there was a need for establishing a museum space so that all those objects can be stored in one place in central London. And that is how we see the South Kensington Museum that came up in 1857, and a large group of objects which were displayed in the 1851 exhibition, they were directed to this South Kensington Museum. And of course, like I mean, today where Victoria Albert Museum stands in London, that is the Kensington area, South Kensington area, and it was initially called as the South Kensington Museum. So this kind of like I mean, history, we can see that what this archiving, this process of making the archive, and then also this documentation, cataloging, and everything were responsible for. So making of these museums, and also making people to sort of like I mean, be part of them, and also like I mean, understanding hierarchy and so many different things. And in all these things, as I have mentioned multiple times, that textile played a very important role. So if we see that some of the early documentations, and perhaps like I mean, we can see in the field of botany, and of course like documentation of people and so on, in this ones we see that there were plants and different kind of vegetal motifs and everything were sort of like I mean, drawn and catalogued. So for example, some of the early documentation would be by William Roxburgh in the late 18th century and early 19th century. So for example, in the left side of the screen, we have an image of that came from William Roxburgh's documentation of the plants in the coast of Coromandel, and that was first published in 1795. And William Roxburgh was also also responsible for sort of setting up the botanical garden, which is across the river from the city of Calcutta, which was the colonial capital and during that time. So what we see that this the documentation of the plants, and eventually these minute drawings were then engraved on metal plate. They were printed on books. They were printed on paper. They were sort of made into books and folios, and then they were hand colored. So in this image, as you can see that the lines were engraved, metal engraved, and then the hand coloring was done on the top of them for making them lifelike. And the entire process was actually a collaborative one in which a number of unknown Indian artisans contributed to them, but unfortunately, or which was also a very strategic move, in which we see that the Indian artisans were never named, but the printers, and then of course William Roxburgh, who compiled all the information and made them into these books, they were recognized. So this kind of documentation we see in the field of botany that started taking place in the late 18th century. But then when we go through William Roxburgh's project, we also see that what kind of plants he was interested in, and a number of plants we can see even in Roxburgh's this folio in the plants of the coast of Coromandel. His documentation starts with this famed chaya root, which is this dye yielding plant which was thought to be responsible, or largely responsible, for making the brilliant red of the Coromandel textiles. So one can see that what kind of plants he was also interested in, that there were different kind of plants, but the plants which were used in dyeing or different kind of medicinal purposes or some kind of activity which had economic value, so those were given priority. And for that reason we find that the chaya root, which was used for yielding red dye, was prioritized in his documentation as well. And now this is in the right side of the screen, we have this dried chaya roots, which comes from the collection of the Botanical Survey of India in Calcutta. And similar kind of this bunch of chaya roots were also sent to the Victoria Albert Museum, that time it would be the South Kensington Museum, and with the proper documentation. I'd also like to sort of draw our attention to this kind of labels, and in which we see how the scientific name like Oldenlandia umbellata and all those ones which would be written there, and then what kind of what species or what family of the plants chaya root come from, all those things will be indicated. And then the geographical location from which this kind of plants are sort of found are also noted in the last sentence here. And then it is also noted that what kind of purpose it served, the root source for red dye. So all this different documentation, we find them to be there when these chaya roots were collected. And this is just one example among many for in which the same kind of documentation strategy was applied to. And this is how these extensive catalogs and the archives were produced. So if this is one way of doing the documentation, and as I have mentioned that even though Roxburgh's documentation was primarily focused in botany, but the role of textile was undeniable, and that's because of its relevance in dyeing, and of course how the textiles were beneficial, economically beneficial for the British. And perhaps that is also one of the reason in which we see that extensive documentation, or how this dye stuff works, was also something that was of interest to the British. And eventually understanding the chemical configuration of the chaya root, that led to the making of this synthetic dye, that is alizarin, in the 19th century. So with those things we see that Roxburgh's collection, there was also the different other kind of documentation and cataloging that took place in the 19th century. And one of them, of course, we have already started talking about it, would be James Forbes Watson. And Watson was someone who was there in the 1860s, 1870s in India, part of South southern India mostly, and Watson was someone who was very much interested in keeping the trade records. So in his this extensive catalogs, which are known as like the collection of specimens of the textile manufacturers of India, and we also see that, I mean, he didn't just stop at the specimens which were collected from the textile manufacturers, but also have collected images, or like, I mean, made the images of the people who wear those textiles. So it's the textile as specimen, and then, like, I mean, how these textiles are actually used by people. So collecting both this kind of information. Now what he did in his albums was actually collecting textile swatches, and he pasted them on his album. So for example, the one we see in the right side of the screen, in which we see there is this cotton hand towel, a fragment of a cotton hand towel, and one can imagine that this is just the border of it, and that is the reason there is this continuation of the motif which runs in the vertical border, and then how that also sort of continues in the horizontal way as well. So this is something we see. And then of course, like, I mean, the corner design, something we have already studied in the shawls and different other textiles. So this is something we can see that what was happening in Forbes Watson's documentation, that he was actually collecting textile swatches and then, like, I mean, pasting them on the paper, almost like pasting the dried botanical specimens. And then we also see on the top of the page there is this similar kind of leveling which was going on in the other specimens. So for example, if we compare it with, like, I mean, this botanical specimen, and here they also followed similar kind of leveling, which was very carefully done and then pasted on the top of this, each of these folios. And here we see that, I mean, of course, that from where it is collected, it is from India, and he also had, like, I mean, certain specimens from Central Asia and so on. So this is collected from India. And then we also see that, I mean, it is prominently written that, I mean, it's a cotton hand towel with, like, I mean, the colored borders, which means, like, I mean, it is block printed and of course with red dye. And then this is something which was perhaps, like, I mean, collected from Madras. So either it is made in Madras or, like, I mean, somewhere in the Coromandel region. And as we already know that how this chaya roots were something which was found in the like, I mean, largely used in the Coromandel region. So one can imagine that, I mean, making of this kind of coarse cotton hand towels and then being printed with red is something that would be there in the Coromandel region as well. So this is the kind of documentation we find that he was in terms of, like, I mean, documenting. He was aware that not all the textiles he wanted to sort of make part of this archives can be collected as a whole, and that's the reason he was collecting fragments of them, cutting them up in small swatches and then pasting them on these catalogs. And that is how the catalogs ended up in the museums, whereas, like, a number of those textiles and the cultures which he was studying, they definitely could not be contained within the archives. Now what other things we can see that, I mean, in some of the other albums we also see that, I mean, he made this, there was not really one uniform way of, like, I mean, doing these albums. Of course we have these individual folios, and in the center stage we have the textile swatches which are prominently presented there. But then, like, in some cases we also have the smaller swatches, and of course for, like, I mean, the examination of the texture as it is written there is there presented. And then, like, I mean, there is no label that is pasted on the top of it, but it was kind of like how no label was pasted on the top of it, but then it was printed on this individual folio pages that what kind of textile we are looking at. So there are those very expensive and at the same time, like, I mean, highly prized and complicated brocades like kinkob and like, I mean, this weft brocades and that we see from Varanasi and other places. So this is a kinkob from Benares, and in which we can see, like, I mean, a number of colors are used for executing this floral motifs on this textile. And then this became part of, like, I mean, this extensive catalogs which they have created during this time. Now the other aspect of this kind of cataloging was to sort of like give us an idea about different kind of textile making practices that took place in the Indian subcontinent. So for example, the making of the block printed textiles in the Coromandel region, in the coast of Gujarat and so on, those were well known. And of course, like the early modern trade documents, at the same time, like some of the surviving early modern textiles and so on, they have attested the presence of this kind of textiles from these regions. Now Forbes Watson's documentation also sort of like makes clear that there were other centers of block printing as well. So for example, here I just wanted to bring up one example, and that is from Fatehgarh in UP, which is not that far from Kanpur. It is around 130-140 kilometers from Kanpur, and this was also a prominent center for making block printed fabrics, where wooden blocks were created and then block printing were done on the bank of the river Ganges. And of course, Fatehgarh and Farrukhabad, these two places which are side by side there, these places were also on the trade route. And since the river Ganges was very much active in terms of for commute, for trade and other relations, so we see that places like Farrukhabad and Fatehgarh were very much well connected to the trader communities. So this is something we see that what kind of these block printed cottons were produced in Fatehgarh and Farrukhabad, the places which are much more sort of understudied in the history of Indian block printing, and of course dyeing and so on. So when in Watson's documentation, it came up in the 19th century, and today we see that there are some block printers or wood block makers in Farrukhabad. So we can imagine certain parts of the practices which were there in the 19th century, and if we compare them with today, so we can see that what are the aspects of the practice which are there and which were perhaps transformed or lost over time. So this kind of documentation of these textiles are also very important, not just for the colonial documentation in the 19th century, but even for the researchers today to understand that what kind of practices have prevailed in certain regions, what existed, and then what's made through time, what sustained and what did not. So all these different aspects of the practice, documentation, cataloging and so on, all those things come together when we consider these aspects of cataloging and documentation there. The other thing we also see, and that would be perhaps from some of the other catalogers, or perhaps the other people who were very much invested in documentations, and that one of them would be Thomas Wardle. And Thomas Wardle was someone who was a textile enthusiast. So unlike Forbes Watson, who was primarily interested in the trade documents, and that's the reason, even though he had the textile swatches and those samples, and he made this minute documentation of all those textile samples he could find, but his primary interest was in the cost and then the other economic aspects of this textiles, and not really in the visual aspects of the textile or the material, the sensory aspects of the textile. Now Thomas Wardle, as we see that he was a contemporary of Forbes Watson, but his interest was very different. So he wanted to study this different kind of textile making that prevailed in South Asia, and then he was someone who wanted to implement this knowledge in his own textile making. So he was someone who was also an industrialist, and he was a dyer. So he wanted to sort of implement the knowledge of studying these textiles in South Asia to make his own organization, or the platform through which he produced his own textiles in the late 19th century in England. So these are some of the textile samples we find which were made by Thomas Wardle in the 1880s and 1890s. So all these samples were made in England, but then we can clearly see that with like the kind of the continuous floral motifs, and then the color scheme, and then of course in the flow of things. So how all those different aspects are very much studied from the textiles in South Asia, in the Indian subcontinent, and then they were also sort of like experimented with when Thomas Waddell carried out these experiments in England in the late 19th century. So this kind of exercises that also tell us that the documentation, cataloging, even though a lot of those practices were very much centered around the colonial administration and their workings, but then there were also people who had different kind of intentions, and that's the reasons their interventions were different. So for example, if we see like Forbes Watson's documentation, that sort of led us to sort of like understanding the different kind of textiles in the 19th century, and then their impact, and of course like the economy around them. Then we see that in Thomas Waddell's documentation, what happened was, of course, he did extensive documentation on the dyeing techniques, and those large albums with the samples of dyed fabrics in cotton, in silk, in wool, and so on, from various parts of the Indian subcontinent were made by Thomas Waddell. Like around 15 of those albums are there in the Botanical Survey of India office in Calcutta, and then like the rest of the albums are there in England. So this kind of like this extensive documentation were done by Thomas Waddell, but he was not primarily interested in sort of like the economy, and then like also about like all the details about the value, like the economic value, and then like the trade relations and everything around cloth. But he was also a maker, he was also an industrialist, and he was also someone who was very much interested in recreating this textiles in his own workshop or studio. So that was the driving force for him to collect the textiles and sort of make them as part of his life. So we can see that even within like this colonial scheme of documentation and cataloging and so on, there were many different kind of stakeholders, and then they contributed to the documentation of these textiles in many different ways. With that, what we also see that Thomas Waddell was someone who was known to people like William Morris, who was prime figure in the art and craft movement in England in the late 19th century. So some of the ethos that they had, so for example, in terms of understanding the way of production, which is not primarily industrial, not really a mass produced object that they were aiming for, but they were sort of like interested in the other forms of production, which was much more laborious, time consuming, but at the same time like in which the maker comes in direct contact with the materials, the techniques, and so on, were something that they were interested in. And for those reasons, what we see there is that how William Morris's engagement in the art and craft movement, Thomas Waddell's engagement in documentation, and then eventually recreating textiles or making his own textiles, all those things sort of intersected. So the colonial documentation of the textiles in the Indian subcontinent, that also made possible of dissemination of the knowledge about Indian textiles to parts of Western Europe. We'll continue this discussion not only in terms of the dissemination of the knowledge, but also representation of the indigenous people in this colonial archives, and how then textile plays an important role there as well in the subsequent lectures. Thank you.